Hello, my name is Suzanne Stanis, and I'm Director of Heritage Education for Indiana Landmarks. I'm also a member of the Preserving Historic Places Preservation Conference Planning Committee. Welcome to the second in our series of virtual conference sessions leading up to our in-person conference in South Bend, September 28th through October 1st, 2021. Please mark your calendars. All of our virtual sessions are available on the conference website. Just search Preserving Historic Places Conference. We want to welcome all of our longtime conference attendees and our new participants. You'll continue to receive notifications about upcoming virtual sessions, and we promise a great conference in South Bend in 2021 to make up for our many months of social isolation. I want to recognize my co-administrators of the conference, Jeannie Regan-Dinius with the Indiana Division of Historic Preservation and Archaeology, Jessica Kramer of Indiana Landmarks, and Liz Monroe of Indiana University. And a special thanks to the many people on our local planning committee in South Bend who are rolling with the COVID punches and keeping things on track. The conference and these virtual sessions would not be possible without the generous financial support of our partners, Indiana Division of Historic Preservation and Archaeology, Indiana Landmarks, Indiana University, and the St. Joseph County Commissioners, along with the sponsors who help keep our conference registration fees affordable and provide scholarships. RC Engineers, the City of South Bend, Cornelius O'Brien Lecture Series, Indiana Housing and Community Development, Marvin Windows, National Park Service, with Janney Elsner Associates, and Visit South Bend, Mishawaka. Additional support is provided by Bergland, Cultural Resource Analysts, Historic Preservation and Heritage Consulting, the Indiana Archaeology Council, Old National Bank, Ratio Architects, and R.E. Diamond and Associates. Please save Thursday, August 20th for our next virtual session. Steve Zadeh, the housing inspector with City of South Bend, will discuss ways code enforcement and preservation commissions can collaborate to develop maintenance standards, especially during the economic hardships associated with COVID-19. Now, just a couple of housekeeping reminders. We're using the webinar version of Zoom today, so attendees' microphones are muted and video is hidden. Please submit your questions using the Q&A feature. I'll be moderating and asking the questions as time allows. This session is being recorded and will be available shortly after the presentation. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Marsh Davis, President of Indiana Landmarks. Marsh is a graduate of Butler University and the graduate program in historic preservation at Ball State. He's also a member of the Preservation Action Board of Directors and served as chair of the Preservation Action Foundation. Marsh is a longtime participant of Preservation Action's Advocacy Week, where he works for all of us to educate Indiana's congressional delegation on the economic benefits of historic preservation. He also knows his way around our State House and frequently testifies about the ways historic preservation revitalizes our communities. And I look forward to learning some insider's tips from Marsh and our guest Russ Carnahan on how to lobby for preservation legislation. Marsh?
Well, thank you, Suzanne. And just a shout out to Jessica Kramer, who is our techie today. You don't see her, but she's working behind the scenes. So thank you for making this possible. And I want to thank all the attendees, particularly I looked at the list of people signed up for this. It's quite a distinguished and accomplished list. So thank you for taking the time to do this. As Suzanne said, we hope to have some time at the end for a little Q&A. But meanwhile, what a great pleasure it is for me to welcome back virtually to Indiana, Russ Carnahan. Russ is the president of Preservation Action and has served in that capacity since 2015. But Russ also served in the United States Congress representing Missouri's 3rd District from 2005 to 2013, served 4 terms. And while in Congress, Russ championed historic preservation and was chair of the Historic Preservation Caucus. He was literally Preservation Action's man on the Hill, and we're so fortunate that he has, in his post-congressional days, has stayed with the movement and is now leading Preservation Action. So with that, I would like to welcome Russ and engage in a little bit of a background before. But first, Russ, thank you for coming back. You're a regular in these conferences in Indiana, so glad you're here.
Well, my trip to Indiana was much faster today than it has been in the past, but it's really great to be with you, Marsh, and with preservation leaders and activists in Indiana for all the great work you do. Great to be with you.
Well, thanks. And you know, we do these conferences, and you present, but we rarely have the chance to get to know the presenters. And I thought maybe with this new format, we've got a little less than an hour to go. Maybe spend a few minutes just talking about your personal background, your family, which is a storied family in Missouri and in state politics. A little bit about your years in Congress, and then your time as leader of the Preservation Caucus. So just tell us a little bit about your background. I think people will be very eager to know about that.
Sure. I was really blessed to grow up in a family that was very active in public life. My dad was a small town lawyer, a town Rolla, Missouri, about 100 miles outside of St. Louis. My mom was active in civic events in the community. And so I kind of grew up in that kind of a household. And then my grandfather, my dad's dad, he'd been a member of Congress from the mid-40s through 1960. So I kind of grew up hearing about my grandfather being active in politics, my dad being very active in the local community, as well as my mom. And so I remember the first memory I have of a political campaign was my dad running for the legislature when I was 8. And so again, just kind of grew up around that. And to me, it seemed normal. I know that maybe to a lot of folks that doesn't seem normal or seems unusual, but that's the kind of house I grew up in, and wound up working in my dad's campaigns in the 1980s and 90s. And he ultimately wound up being governor of Missouri, and then was actually running for the U.S. Senate in the year 2000 when he was killed in a plane crash, and lost he and my brother and a good friend on that plane. He wound up winning the election in a oddity of history, and for all the tragedy, and my mother wound up being appointed to the Senate seat. So again, very hard time, but inspiring time for my family. And my sister and I both went on to hold public office. I was elected that same year to the state legislature, and then later to Congress in 2005. So it's kind of the family I grew up in, and some of my inspiration and motivation to be involved.
Well, I know, and I've spent time with you in Washington, and I get the sense like once you've really been in Congress for a while, you never really leave. So your perspective continues. I just share. It could be a long topic, but just maybe briefly, your years in Congress, how they might contrast with the way Congress is today. I mean, it's been quite a bit of change since 2005 and the years that followed.
Well, it's kind of a good news, bad news. You know, if you look at it in the most optimistic light, and the thing that you witness, if you're in Congress or around public service, you really see typically kind of the best and the worst in people. You know, I'm an optimist myself. You know, if you think about it, the thing I really loved personally and kind of in terms of public impact, our system, when it works, is really a beautiful thing. If you think about it, whether it's a state legislature, you know, when I served there, I always felt like you had the whole state in one room. And the same thing in Congress. You kind of feel like when you're in that chamber of Congress, you've got the whole country in one room, literally. You have people from every corner of the country, every kind of political belief, profession, and out of all that, when the system works, you get consensus and you can move things and really get things done. To me, that's kind of the art of politics.
Yeah.
But you also see some of the worst. You see what's become kind of a political food fight, far too much division, far too much distrust. And so I think it's incumbent on all of us, whether you're in office or out, to try to build those bridges between citizens and their elected officials. And frankly, elected officials do a heck of a lot better when they have good input from their constituents and experts on any given issue. And that's where I think historic preservation has really, it's been a real pleasure and joy for me to see that continue to grow, those kind of connections between those citizens who really understand and appreciate and have expertise in historic preservation with their elected officials, because we get better policy and better outcomes when we do that.
Yeah, and so in the midst of this food fight, as you put it, what I've observed and others is that historic preservation is really quite bipartisan. It really crosses the aisle in ways that a lot of other topics do not. And so you were chair of the Historic Preservation Caucus. Can you just say a few words about the caucus and what its purpose is and how it functions?
Yeah, so the historic there are many caucuses in the Congress. They're kind of almost like unofficial committees, if you will. Most of the work is done in congressional committees, by subject matter. But also caucuses have a long tradition in the Congress, and they're really informal groups that organize around a particular issue. Historic Preservation Caucus has been around a long time. Long before I came to Congress, has always been bipartisan, as it should be, and it's really a group of like-minded legislators to be able to coordinate and really be the go-to people on historic preservation issues. And that's why we've always been given a regular request to members and their staff to join and be a member of the Historic Preservation Caucus, because it's you can imagine trying to get 435 people in one room organized to do anything, let alone, people with a lot of strong different opinions. So being able to organize around issues like that is a really important tool in a legislative body.
Well, in Indiana, just so our audience knows, we have right now only one official member of the Preservation Caucus. That's Representative Andre Carson. But the Indiana group that attended Advocacy Week in Washington this past March got a solid commitment from Representative Walorski, who enthusiastically said yes. All hell sort of broke loose a day or two after that meeting with Representative Walorski. So we've got to follow up on that promise that she made. But we're glad that we have bipartisan representation in Indiana. So what a little bit more personally before we move on to the other topics, but what drew you into historic preservation? I mean, as a member of Congress, you've got a gazillion issues you got to face, and it's always fascinates me what members of Congress grab onto as their kind of their favorite causes, and obviously preservation is one of your favorite causes. So what led you into that?
Yeah, well, just when you go to Congress, it's you kind of feel like you're going to grad school or going to college, and you're picking your coursework. You're picking the courses you want to take, and some are kind of required courses, and some are optional courses. But depending on your district, my district in St. Louis, it was a transportation hub, so I wanted to be on the transportation committee. I was interested in foreign affairs, so I got on the foreign affairs committee. I was interested in science and technology, got on the science and technology committee. And then some of these other caucus issues go back to, St. Louis, my district, had long time involvement with historic preservation, a lot of historic districts in St. Louis, going all the way down the Mississippi River to the oldest permanent settlement west of the Mississippi, St. Genevieve, Missouri. And so there's a lot of history. Of course, personally, I was very much interested in history, but so was my district. So I had been back in the 1990s when my father was governor. He was very much involved in passage of the Missouri State Historic Tax Credit, which was considered one of the models around the country. But also, as a young practicing attorney in this rural county, we had a Civil War era courthouse that was in terrible shape. And the voters finally passed a measure to fund building a new courthouse. And the county commissioners gave a pretty weak promise to give historic interest an opportunity to save it. Otherwise, they were going to tear it down and make it into a parking lot. So I wound up creating a nonprofit organization, the Old Courthouse Preservation Committee. And after the ballot measure passed by the citizens in the county, I walked into the county commissioner's office and they said, okay, we're going to give you a chance to do this. And they deeded it to us for $1. And so the organization took it over and was able to operate it and rent out offices to create some funding. And so I was motivated to do that, but because a few years earlier, we had a historic train station in our town that was sort of in the dark of night demolished. And so that was sort of the impetus in our town to organize around preserving some of our history. And so that was my first foray into, stopping the bulldozer, a historic building. But that kind of formally got me into it. And then when I went to the state legislature, was very involved in our state historic tax credit, preserving that. And it was a natural progression when I represented a district in Congress to take up the federal issues around historic preservation.
Yeah, well, we're all very envious of Missouri for the robust tax credit that you've had. We're not quite there yet in Indiana, but it's kind of the holy grail that we seek. But your role in that is greatly appreciated. So now you're president of Preservation Action, and I know that a lot of the people who are viewing this session are familiar with Preservation Action. Some may be members, some may even be board members. I'm not entirely certain, but it may be even with that, if you could just give us a little background of Preservation Action, what its function is, what is its niche in the world of historic preservation?
Yeah, Preservation Action is really unique in historic preservation in the country. Back during the 1970s, when a lot of the movement started and the historic preservation programs were started nationally, a lot of the impetus behind that was a committee of mayors from around the country that had come together because of historic preservation issues in their cities. And so around that, and then I think some of the work that Jackie Kennedy had done, doing preservation work in the White House, of course, very famously in the early 60s, and some of the work that she had done in Washington and New York. A lot of those efforts led to the 1970s passage of the Historic Preservation Act and creating the Historic Preservation Fund. And so about that time is when Preservation Action was started with the intention to be the national network for historic preservation advocacy in Washington. So that's really how this came about. And Preservation Action has kind of risen and fallen over the years. We're on a very good trend and on the rise in recent years. We saw a good example, nothing like a real threat to get people's attention and get us organized, but when the tax bill a few years ago completely eliminated, zeroed out the federal historic tax credit, which is such a vital tool for preservation in the country, it really jolted the attention, I think, of preservation leaders and organizations and grassroots supporters around the country. And through that network, really successfully got the credit saved. It was altered slightly, but still intact. And I think that model really showed historic preservation folks. I always say the good news, there are lots of historic preservation organizations. But also the bad news, the challenge is there's lots of historic preservation organizations. So how do you organize them? And we really showed through that historic tax credit fight that when we work together and coordinate and stay focused, we can really have an impact. And since then, we've seen many other successes, and some of which I think we're going to cover today, that really shown the impact of that national organizing and preservation action really being the large umbrella partner to help bring those groups together.
Yeah, and I think it's safe to go way back too. I mean, the recent battle over the tax credit was a great victory, and many players in that, including Preservation Action. But going back even to the early days when the credit was new and not entirely embraced, and then with the tax reform acts of the 1980s, there was a lot of threat to the tax credit, and Preservation Action has rightly received a lot of credit for leading the way in preserving the tax credit back when it was truly threatened in the earlier years. So this was a nice continuation of that tradition. The most recent fight. Some of the early leaders are still with us. We had Tersh Boasberg, was one of the founders of Preservation Action. Some of you in the audience might recognize that name. Nellie Longsworth was the first president, I believe, of Preservation Action. And Russ, you're following her tradition of visiting Indiana. She was also a perennial visitor here, and so it's great to continue these traditions. But this niche that I'm trying to define for Preservation Action, we've often been called the grassroots preservation advocacy group, and it's a term which is very dear to people in Indiana. Albert Beveridge, a senator from Indiana, actually coined that term many years ago. So the grassroots is certainly something that comes out of Indiana, but I'm not sure that's the best term, but that's the way Preservation Action has often been defined. Do you want to maybe just distinguish that from some of the other players that are strong preservation advocates?
Indeed, there's virtually every organization, whether it's historic preservation or teachers or doctors or environmental groups or automobile manufacturers, every group has a national association in Washington that often has executives and government relations staff that work on legislation and work on Capitol Hill. Preservation Action has been very much engaged in that, but the way that we do it is really through grassroots, or some say grass tops, preservation leaders around the country. And our focus has really been on coordinating with the statewide historic preservation groups, because that's the best kind of organizational building block for a national organization. But we've also been working, especially in recent years, to reach out to more of the larger and small, and even some of the medium and smaller local historic preservation groups, because they can certainly add and be a very important part of advocacy. And so our focus has been to bring those groups together with their elected officials in Washington, so that we think they can make the best case as constituents, as voters, as people on the ground in their communities that can say, these are things where historic preservation has made a difference for our economy, for our culture, for tourism. You can just go down the list of all the amazing impacts that it has in our community and why it's important, but nothing brings it home to an elected official like local examples and local people who care about it. So we really view that as Preservation Action's role, to build those kind of bridges to really have an impact in really unique and in often ways stronger ways than an organization that may have a team of lawyers and lobbyists in Washington, because we're bringing people from their communities.
Well, hold that thought. We'll get back to that later. I think that is kind of the essence of preservation action and the what it brings to the table. But let's take a break and talk about some of the key policy initiatives that preservation action is focusing on. I think this is what people really want to know. Like, what are you doing? What is it you're advocating for specifically at this time? And I know there's some bills in play right now. And if you could give us a little insight to some of these, why don't we start with some happy news, happy bipartisan news about the Great American Outdoors Act.
Yeah, so I'm going to grab my cheat sheet here, but the Great American Outdoors Act, which has a great catchy name, we love the name, but it really has been a culmination of a kind of long-standing shortfall in the Land and Water Conservation Fund, in a historic backlog, maintenance backlog that impacts a lot of historic structures in our national parks. And so this is a great example of bipartisan work. You had really strong coalitions of Republicans and Democrats came through the Senate with the big vote. We actually hosted the primary sponsor of the bill, Congressman Cunningham from South Carolina, that handled the House bill. But it wound up coming through the House. Just to give you an example, 310 votes to 107. It's hard to pass a bill about motherhood and apple pie these days to get those big of votes. And so that is gone through. And just to give you some numbers, it includes $900 million annually dedicated to addressing deferred maintenance in the national parks and other public lands. And it's been used to help preserve key sites, battlefields like Gettysburg, iconic sites like the Brown versus Board of Education National Historic Site, and $12 billion in backlog maintenance, nearly half of which will go to historic resources in our parks. So it's a really big deal. It's bipartisan, and that has made it through, even in this contentious political environment, even in this emergency economic and health environment that we're in, because this has a great impact on our economy, our culture, jobs. And so it was a real home run for historic preservation advocates.
And it may sound like it's all about the great outdoors, but the national park system is owner of thousands. I can't remember the exact number, but it's a staggering number of historic properties within the national parks. And you mentioned the deferred maintenance. So this is something that the preservation community has been working on for years. And this is a huge step forward, because these are some of our nation's most wonderful historic places, and some are in buildings, structures. It's not just it's not just all about the natural environment. So this is a big push.
And to be in this environment where there's such a strong emphasis on, things we're doing to help recovery and jobs and small businesses, these projects are going to impact a lot of local businesses that do work, and a lot of local jobs, and they're going to be doing good work. So it's like I said, it's a real home run that preservation took a prominent role in, and we think can have a really important impact on the economy.
Great. And as we talk about these legislative acts, I know that we'll be providing links to some of them. I see even in the chat that's going on now. So certainly by the end of this, we'll have links to get you more information about the bills that Russ is talking about. Let's talk about the Moving Forward Act, which has, I think, been successful in the House. and particularly its impact on the historic tax credits. It's very beneficial to historic preservation, particularly at this difficult time where the incentive to continue the development is really critical. You want to talk about that, Russ, a little bit?
Yeah, so the Moving Forward Act is really a very broad, comprehensive infrastructure bill that was passed in the House. It's really, I would describe it as kind of the Democratic majority in the House. It's their kind of major comprehensive plan for infrastructure. And so we have included in that are these components with regard to improving the historic tax credit, what's been called the Historic Tax Credit Growth and Opportunity Act, or HTC GO. And so it really has some short-term improvements in those existing programs to bump up the percentages and the dollars behind them, again, to spur economic activity. There's a long, and I know everybody on this call has seen lots of probably local data and national data of the economic impact, jobs impact that multiplies throughout the economy. That is part of the, part of what is documented impact of the federal historic tax credit. And so this is really a recognition by Congress that in this economic challenging time that we're in, these programs not only work, but by bumping up their percentages and numbers, that it can really have even greater impact during this time period. So this is a bill that is not, that's the sort of good news about it. The bad news is that bill is not likely to pass in its current form on the Senate side, but I think there's a high likelihood that HTO GO provision will wind up in another Senate bill down the road. So, but it's great that it got through in that major bill in the House. And again, to me, it's a really great example of an acknowledgement by Congress that these programs really have a major economic and jobs impact. And so it's the work that Preservation Action and others, other national coalition partners have been involved in, and many of you locally. Those stories have really made an impact with members of Congress, and to be able to especially show them local examples of where these programs have really had an impact. Those kind of things are very powerful tools to get members of Congress behind these things. So it's thank you all for being a part of that.
I want to put you on the spot here for a minute. Going back to the Great American Outdoors Act, I was pleased to see that we had a majority of Indiana's congressional delegation voting in support of that, and it was bipartisan to the extent that Indiana can actually be bipartisan. There's not a lot of buy going on there, but there was enough to make this, our vote on that was truly bipartisan. Who would you say, again, this may be not the easiest question, but who would you say in both the House and the Senate are the real champions of historic preservation? Much as you were back when you were in Congress, who do we look to now as the top voice for preservation?
Yeah, in the House, again, this is we have bipartisan co-chairs. I was succeeded by Congressman Earl Blumenauer of Oregon, and Earl is just a true champion of historic preservation. He's been the co-chair of the caucus for these last several years. The Republican co-chair is Mike Turner of Ohio. He'd been previously mayor of Dayton and as mayor was involved in several historic preservation projects in his city. So he had just a great background as a mayor being involved in historic preservation. So they both, again, they're different political parties, different parts of the country, but they really have been fantastic champions in the House. The Senate is a bit more diverse, but I think the Senator Cassidy from Louisiana has to, I think, receive top billing because he really he serves on the key Senate Finance Committee where the historic tax credit legislation had basically gone to die and had been cut out, and it had passed through the House, zeroed out. The administration had recommended zeroing it out. It was about to be zeroed out in the Senate Finance Committee, and almost single-handedly, Senator Cassidy from Louisiana stood up. Again, has a lot of historic significance in his state, not just New Orleans, but around the state. And he really stood up, got the tax credit put back in. And so I would have to, that's my Senate pick right now.
Yeah. Well, one of the other perennial focuses of preservation action, as well as the National Trust and NICSPO, is to advocate for the Historic Preservation Fund. And we've been making some more than incremental progress in that in recent years. And you want to say anything about the current appropriations that we're looking at and the increase that we're hoping for?
I will. Let me give just a brief bit of background. So the Historic Preservation Fund is actually the money for that fund comes from a small fee that offshore oil and gas drilling pays. And that fee goes into the Historic Preservation Fund. And so that's been a critical piece for funding historic preservation. It funds many programs, and I'm going to give you some examples, but it's been authorized at a maximum of $150 million a year, but rarely has that much been actually appropriated. So, but the last, I believe we're on year 3 or 4, where we've had incremental increases in the fund, and at a time when, again, between difficult economy often, between other competing interests, between some divisions in Congress, this has been a unifying bipartisan amount of funding. And so the most recent Interior Appropriations package that came out that has 136 million, that's about an 18 million increase, and broken down, especially the biggest recipients are the state historic preservation offices. So your Indiana SHPO is going to be part of that benefit. They have an increase of 3 million up to 55.6 million. The tribal historic preservation offices have an increase of 1.2 million up to 15 million now. The Save America's Treasures grants are funded at 25 million. Civil rights movement grants, 18 million. Civil rights grants for all Americans, 4 million. Historically Black colleges and universities, 10 million. Paul Brune Historic Revitalization Grants, 7.5 million. Those are primarily focused in rural areas, and then underrepresented communities, 1 million. So it really covers a wide range of historic preservation programs, and that's been one of our primary advocacy areas, the importance of keeping that funding stable and gradually growing. And so it's just, again, an example of those things don't happen by accident. This is a lot of relationship building with key members of Congress, connecting them to key leaders in their states, making the case. That's how this happened.
And I would like to give a shout out to our State Historic Preservation Office, who has been very effective in putting those funds to work throughout our state in ways I think that the other states are envious of. So it's an important, very important in the scheme of what we deal with in the federal budget. It's almost non-existent, but that 136 million is critical to the preservation movement, and we fight for it every year. It's a top priority.
And the other point I would add is, as I said earlier, it's not coming from general tax revenue. It's coming from this dedicated, relatively small fee that oil and gas companies pay for offshore drilling.
And when was that fee set? That fee was set back in the 70s, right? And we're still
I think the late 70s.
So it's a good fight. We fight it every year. And given that, why don't you tell us about how people can get involved with Preservation Action, and a little bit about our Advocacy Week and our membership, and just how Preservation Action functions, but really how our audience here, if they're not involved, how they can get involved in advocacy, certainly at the federal level.
Well, first of all, Marsh, I'm going to use you as the example here, but our really vital building block for Preservation Action are the statewide historic preservation organizations. Indiana has one of the strongest, best funded statewide historic preservation organizations. And Marsh, you personally and professionally have been longtime advocate and leader, our former chairman of PA and still active. And you've helped us connect with your statewide conferences. And so your involvement of your statewide organization is really vital in our national network. So thank you. If others are on the call that are with perhaps a local historic preservation organization, one of the ways you can get involved is to have your organization join PA as an organizational ally. And again, those organizational ally memberships start at $100 a year, so it's a minimal cost. One of the things that you will benefit from is, not just our overall communication and programs, but we do a monthly advocacy leaders call, and we give you a quick 30-minute briefing on what's going on each month in DC. We've also had frequent special guests, members of Congress and others that have briefed you, and so we really try to bring together some key policy makers with our preservation advocacy leaders. So I'd encourage you, if you're one of the leaders or active in a local historic preservation group, join us. And then as individuals, would encourage you to join as an individual. If you're not an individual member, membership start at $40, and sign up for our emails. We have one of the best weekly legislative updates out there. I wouldn't say one of the best, I'll just say the best. It's been around for many years. Rob Naylor on our staff pulls that together each week, and it's a great tool. We know that each of you are not working on federal advocacy in Washington all day, every day. So we try to really give you the best, most efficient information, how you can help with your congressional delegation. But also, we think a lot of the work that we're doing nationally can really help you with what you're doing at the state and local level as well. And then learning from other advocates in preservation. So the easy thing to do is go to our website, and happy to follow up with any of you. But those are ways that you can link up with Preservation Action and really be a part of this national network.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, sorry, we've got about 15 minutes left. So just a reminder, if anybody has any questions, to type them into the Q&A and we'll address them. We did have a question come in about the current administration trying to weaken some federal regulations like NEPA, and just wondered if you can give us any insight on that.
Yeah, so NEPA is the National Environmental Protection Act, and it sets up procedures for federal projects to be viewed by historic preservation and to get local input. The administration has proposed and kind of rapidly finalized these rules that include changes that would dramatically impact consideration of cultural and historic resources, make it easier for federal agencies to move forward on projects without public engagement and without traditional review in terms of historic preservation. So that Preservation Action and other preservation groups spoke out during the public comment period. The public comments were vastly lopsided against watering down these NEPA regulations, but that is the case right now, and I think depending on the outcome of the election, those could be either continued or reversed, but that is a concern. When we made the point that really unwarranted to the historic preservation reviews and public comment were not going to affect these programs in any substantial way. So that's an ongoing concern and ongoing conversation.
Got another question. Could passage of full permanent funding for Land and Water Conservation Fund be a catalyst for obtaining full permanent funding for the Historic Preservation Fund?
The short answer is yes. It's something we've talked about, dreamed about for a long time, so that we didn't have to go through this appropriations process every few years. But that's not likely to happen this year. But I think it's always on our agenda, and we can use the Land and Water Conservation Fund as an example. So, this was done here, here's why. A lot of parallels with the Historic Preservation Fund. But that's, again, that's in the short term, that's not likely to happen. But it's something, particularly as we get closer to actual appropriated dollars to that authorization cap, then we'll have another issue of whether we need to try to grow that authorization cap of $150 million.
And then also organizations like Indiana Landmark, so many places say, contact your representatives, let them know what's going on. From your insider's perspective in Congress, what's the best way to get an elected official's attention? Is it a phone call? Is it an email? What do you recommend to our constituents?
Well, any or all of those things, whatever's easier for you. Email is probably the easiest for most people. But I'll just give you a quick example. When I was in Congress, literally got thousands of phone calls and emails and letters, and staff would summarize every week. This week, you got 200 letters about Social Security. You got 400 about the veterans, and they would summarize what people were writing about, and then I would have them pick out 10 of those, and I would personally call them. We always would respond in writing, but we would also call people, and it was kind of funny because I would often call and say, hi, this is Congressman Carnahan, and 90% of the time people believe me, and I'd have to tell them, no, I got your letter about historic preservation. But most members are very diligent, as are their staffs, about the communication they get, and they care about so if they're hearing from people about historic preservation, then it makes a difference. And so I know that sometimes that seems daunting or awkward for people. Preservation Action has been involved in this for a long time. We try to make it easy, even put together draft letters that people can use. And actually this week, we've launched a new tool that makes that even easier. If you go to our website, we're going to have some information up in the next few days where you can actually click on, it'll automatically connect you with your legislators and have draft letters ready to use. And so another reason to please sign up, go to the preservationaction.org website and sign up for our e-newsletter. That's free, and you'll get that information and get our updates. So take a look at that. But yeah, absolutely, it makes a difference. We encourage folks to do that. It's not difficult, it doesn't take a lot of time, but it really does make a difference.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize something you said earlier about the information that flows from Preservation Action. It is really outstanding. I believe Rob Naylor is part of the audience today. So Rob, if you're out there, you are prolific, and I would encourage you all to follow Russ's guidance and sign up for it, because it's timely, it's informative, and it's as you said, Russ, it's the best that's out there. But there's also another thing that Preservation Action does, which I really love, and that's the annual Advocacy Week. Now, we used to call it Lobby Day, but it's not really a week, but it's like 2 days and a half of gathering. Hopefully we can do it again soon in March. Not sure, but it's an annual gathering of Preservation Action and National Trust, the National Council of State Historic Preservation Offices, and other entities that get together once a year and strategically lobby for things like the Historic Preservation Fund, the tax credits, and so forth. Maybe just a word, Russ, about how Advocacy Week works and how people can. It just would be wonderful to have more people from Indiana attend and participate in this. I just think it's of all of the out of town things that I get to attend with respect to historic preservation, those 2.5 days in DC where you're focused and collaborating are just the best. So give us a little word about what happens.
Well, to your point, thank you, Marsh. To the point you made and the point I made earlier about you see the best and the worst of things in Congress. This is an example of one of those best of things because it is citizens, going to Washington, talking to their elected representatives, giving them information, telling them about local impact and national impact, and arming them to make better policy decisions. It's like that's the way our representative Congress is supposed to work. And Congress makes a lot of bad decisions when they don't get good information or they try to rush through and do something. But this is, to me, it's like this is the way the Congress works best. But for that to happen, it requires citizens to show up to do that. And so that's why this Advocacy Week each year has been really our signature event. But really every day is an Advocacy Day to be able to reach out to a member. We also have encouraged folks to engage with their members back home. Every senator and representative has at least one or more congressional offices with staff. reaching out to those, inviting them. Again, during this COVID time period, we're not doing a whole lot of in-person events, but prior to this, and hopefully in the future, invite your members of Congress to events. They're looking for things to do back home where they can meet people and talk about important issues. And even virtually, invite them. Many staffers and members of Congress are on virtual calls like this multiple times every day. And so consider inviting them during this time period. And I think you'd be surprised how well you'll be able to connect with them.
We've got about 5 minutes left. If there's any other questions, please send them in. But any advice that the two of you have for historic preservation students that are getting into the field right now?
Well, let me jump in real quickly, Russ. And this doesn't answer the question fully, but again, I think if I could remember back when I was a preservation student, it would have benefited me so much to attend Advocacy Week. In fact, we do have a growing group of scholars that we receive scholarships, young people who are, many of them in historic preservation programs, to attend Advocacy Week. So if that is something you can take advantage of, please do. And I hope we can build up that. What we didn't mention is that Preservation Action is, of course, a lobbying organization. It's an advocacy group. There is a nonprofit component to that, which is Preservation Action Foundation. And as a nonprofit entity, Preservation Action Foundation can receive contributions and grants and so forth that the lobbying arm cannot. So in the last 2 years, we've been receiving donations to help fund these scholarships. So stay tuned for that as well. And if any of you are listening that would like to support Preservation Action, know that you can do that through the Preservation Action Foundation if you're interested in a tax-deductible gift. So I'll yield the floor to the colleague.
And let me add just really quickly to that. Pre-COVID, we've always done these advocacy weeks in Washington in person. In March of next year, I don't think anybody really knows what the situation is going to be, and so we at least tentatively are planning to do kind of a hybrid event, if you will, with a much smaller in-person group in Washington, but also really take advantage of this virtual technology and to greatly expand the number of people that can participate in Advocacy Week by using this virtual technology. So stay tuned for that. And as other groups are, we're still figuring out how best to do that. But whether you're in DC or at your home or office, we are working on ways that you'll be able to participate virtually, and we think even greatly expand how many people can engage during Advocacy Week. So stay tuned.
Well, I'd like to thank our sponsors and Russ and Marsh, and we look forward to seeing Russ. We hope to have you in South Bend in person in 2021, so we will look forward to that. We'll be sending all of our participants links to some of the things that we talked about today, how to get more information on preservation action and some of the legislation. Any closing words from our speakers?
Just really a big thank you for having me. Thank you, Marsh and Indiana Preservation, for your leadership, not just what you're doing in Indiana, but also the impact that you all have had nationally. Just a big thank you. And even in this strange environment we're living in, there's still a lot of great and important work we can do. And I would encourage one last thing. If you go to our website and under the menu under 2020, there is a link to a webinar that we did on Historic Preservation's Role in Recovery, done by Don Ripkema, was featured from Place Economics. And it's just a great overview for all of us, I think, to remember the important role historic preservation has always had in our communities, but its critical role in our economic recovery.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. Remember, we'll have this session available on the Preserving Historic Places website, and hope to see you at our next program on August 20th. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.